single cell has its own axon, its own signaling end, but axons aren't individually running in your body as like little threads everywhere. They tend to run together as like a big cable of axons, right? And then maybe between muscles, maybe next to an artery, and then eventually individual axons will branch off and go to their destinations, whatever cell they're communicating with. But in your body, when you see these big, or in your cats, you'll see these big yellow bundles. Those are nerves. They are bundles of axons running together, many, many axons from many, many cells running together in your body. A ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies out inside of your body. So there will be a number of locations where we find cell bodies that are somewhere speckled in our body. These are called ganglia. They're like little neighborhoods, little clusters of cell bodies. Again, when a neuron is out in your body, they tend to live in clusters. They tend to be beside other neurons. So we don't have houses all spread out all over town. We have houses in a neighborhood, and then there's a grocery store nearby that we can all use, right? So it's kind of the same idea. Get the most efficiency when we bundle things together. So ganglia are going to be clusters of cell bodies that are out in your body. Ganglia is plural, ganglion would be one. Terminate. So we are going to pay attention to where a neuron's axon terminus is located. The termination point tells us what that neuron is controlling, or who that neuron is communicating to, right? What that neuron is communicating to. Neurons can only communicate in one direction, so that axon terminus can tell us a lot about what that neuron is. The synapse, that's going to be that relationship between the axon terminus of a neuron and its target cell. That could be neuron to neuron, that could be neuron to muscle cell, right? Like a neuromuscular junction. So again, that synapse is telling us who's communicating to who's controlling who. Effector cells. Effector cells are going to be the cells in your body that are capable of responding to a neuron. So you can release acetylcholine all you want on your skin cells, but they're not going to do anything. Those keratinocytes, they don't have acetylcholine receptors. They can't receive any sort of signal. Only certain cells in your body are capable of responding. And in fact, it's really limited. The effector cells in your body are limited to skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. That's what neurons are capable of controlling. So we call those the effector cells. Skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands.
Sorry, you said the synapsal relationship between what?
The neuron and the cell is controlling. So we can only control certain cell types in the body, right? That's it. Those are the 4 cell types that are capable of responding to a neuron. Skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. We know that a neuron communicates by sending an electrical signal called an action potential, resulting in the release of a chemical called a neurotransmitter. So we refer to that as electrochemical communication. So we'll do a quick review of that action potential, that's the electrical part of this, and a quick review of neurotransmitter exocytosis, that's the chemical part of this. That's how a neuron communicates to its effector cell. Action potentials, we know already that these are an all or nothing event. If that threshold potential is met at the axon hillock, then it triggers the opening of voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels. And then those openings would trigger the next sets. So an action potential is never going to fizzle out. There's no such thing as a weak action potential. It's an all or nothing event. If it starts, it will finish all the way to the end of the axon. And the action potential will always take every single axon branch. It doesn't just pick one pathway. If an axon is branching, the action potential will head down each branch. It's just like lighting a stick on fire, a twig with lots of branches. Fire doesn't just pick one path, it's going to spread evenly down all of those branches. Same thing here for an action potential. think in my illustration on the board, when we first started that, I started talking about those sodium potassium pump proteins and how it results in that more negative inside than outside, right? More negative inside of the cell. And that more negative inside of a neuron can be measured. And I gave you the number -70 millivolts. Not a number you need to memorize for my class, but something you'll see in the future in like physiology, for example. Well, graded potential has to do with that resting potential. It turns out it's not always the same. It's not always -70. We can have our neurons be more sensitive, meaning that they're quicker to fire. They're quicker to send an action potential. And the way to do that would be holding that resting potential a little closer to the threshold. Maybe up at -60, right? A little bit closer to the threshold potential. Makes it quicker for that neuron to fire. We could also desensitize our neurons by pulling them more negative. So that's where the graded potential comes in on how sensitive a neuron is to firing. Some are more sensitive, some are less sensitive, and that's one way that that can occur with graded potentials. That's all I'm ever going to say about graded potentials. I just want you to hear it and recognize that -70 is not like the end all be all. It's not always the case. All right, we're never going to talk about those again. All right. Nervous system anatomical divisions. So big picture here. We break our nervous system down into peripheral and central. Central nervous system involves anything contained within the brain and or the spinal cord. That's it. Brain and or spinal cord. Over here, central nervous system. In order for something to belong to your central nervous system, it has to be completely contained within the brain and or the spinal cord. Your peripheral nervous system is the PNS. Your peripheral nervous system would then be anything that's outside of the brain and or the spinal cord. So those nerves that are running through your body, right? Those are bundles of axons outside of the central nervous system. They're in your body. Those are part of your peripheral nervous system. Those ganglia, those clusters of cell bodies that I mentioned, these little bulges right here, those are outside of the spinal cord. They're close to it, but they're still outside of the spinal cord. Those ganglia are part of your peripheral nervous system. There are networks of nerves called plexuses. There's a great big plexus in your digestive system. It's called the enteric plexus. That's outside of your brain and spinal cord, clearly. So that's part of the peripheral nervous system. Again, anything that's outside of the brain or spinal cord is the PNS. Now your PNS is attached to your central, right? So we talked about how those muscle cells, those motor neurons, the motor neurons that are controlling myofibers. I was saying earlier that they're in your spinal cord, they're cell bodies. But then their axons come out through a nerve and go down to whatever muscles in your body. Those guys are part of your peripheral nervous system. Their cell bodies are in the spinal cord, but their axons are not. So in order for something to be in the central nervous system, it has to be 100% contained within the central nervous system. And those motor neurons are not. They're attached by their cell bodies, but they are not 100% contained in the spinal cord. Their axons leave and head out in your body. So those would be PNS neurons, peripheral nervous system neurons. All right. So that was the structural anatomical distinctions. We have functional distinctions of our nervous system. So function is like, what do these guys do? Well, we know neurons communicate. The type of communication then is what's going to distinguish the function. If a communication is coming into the central nervous system, then it's described as sensory communication. Sensory communication is usually telling your central nervous system something about your environment, something about your body or the environment around you. Sensory input, a really simple one, right? We have vision, we see something. Those wavelengths of light are gonna stimulate some neurons in our eyes that send a signal into the brain, right? That's sensory. In your central nervous system, the function there is processing. We call that integration. Right? So you're receiving lots of sensations at the same time, right? You're receiving vision, you're receiving sound sensations, maybe touch sensations. There's a lot going on. Your brain is processing all of that. So the brain neurons are doing this job of integration, and that integration includes spinal cord neurons as well. That's going to happen in your central nervous system. And then any sort of communication that controls an effector tissue, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands, that's called motor function. So the motor output function would be the control. And it's pretty simple. Like for muscle, any of those three muscles, right, the communication is either to start contracting or stop contracting, right? It's either to contract or relax. And then for the glands, the communication is either to secrete or don't secrete, right? That's pretty much it. So this whole chart kind of breaks all of that down. Over here in blue is sensory input. So these are the different types of sensory inputs that can come into the central nervous system, your brain and your spinal cord, where integration and processing takes place. So we can have sensory input called somatic sensory. Somatic sensory is body sensations. Soma means body. So think of somatic sensory input as the body sensations that you're like consciously aware of. Touch, temperature, right? Those kinds of sensations. That's gonna come into the central nervous system, and it's actually there that you experience those sensations, right? Have you ever had like your skin desensitized, maybe for a surgery, or like to get stitches, right? They like inject lidocaine or something to like desensitize your skin. So your sensory neurons then no longer send a signal, but somebody can touch you in that like numbed area, and you're getting touched, but you're not experiencing that touch because the signal is not triggering those neurons in your brain. We experience all of our sensations with our brains, not with our bodies. You're experiencing vision with your brain. Your brain is responsible for putting this picture together that you're seeing. Your eyes are just receptors, right? They're just receptors sending signals to the brain. If we were to somehow pinch or cut our optic nerve, these cells in your eyes, the photoreceptors, are still alive and healthy and able to receive a signal and be stimulated by light, but you won't be able to see because that signal doesn't reach your occipital lobe. And it's back here, these neurons that need to be stimulated so that we can put this picture together. So it's a really, I don't know, I think it's kind of a cool concept to think of, like everything you experience happens because neurons in your brain get stimulated. Your brain is responsible for all of your sensations. Everything in your body is just a receptor sending those signals in. So that's somatic sensations, generally sensations that you're consciously aware of. We also have a whole set of sensations that are coming into your brain and spinal cord that are called autonomic sensations. The autonomic sensations are sensations that maybe you're not quite consciously aware of, like blood pressure. Anybody know what their blood pressure is? I don't. But my brain does, because if my blood pressure drops too low, then my brain's gonna respond by telling the smooth muscle in my blood cells to constrict those blood vessels. So we get blood vessel constriction that elevates blood pressure, right, to compensate for low blood pressure. I'm not consciously aware of that, but my brain is constantly monitoring that and can respond by controlling smooth muscle, right? By controlling cardiac muscle, can elevate my heart rate if necessary. So all of that, those responses are coming from these autonomic sensations, right? right? Like at this point in time, I don't know where my breakfast is. Is it still in my stomach? Did it move to my small intestine? I don't know. But there are stretch receptors in those organs that are going to respond and send a signal when they get stretched to the brain. Your brain knows exactly where your breakfast is. And it's gonna send a signal back to the smooth muscle in that location to say, all right, time to start churning, right? Move that food around, let's get it absorbed and move through the digestive tract. Those are autonomic sensations. We have a whole set of sensations and motor output that's actually all here in your digestive tract. It's called the enteric nervous system. I group the enteric and autonomic sensations pretty much together because these are a type of autonomic sensation that are coming into the central nervous system as well. But the unique thing about your digestive system is that it actually does not require the central nervous system to initiate a response. And that's illustrated on the chart here by this long arrow here, where there's this whole network where a sensory receptor, for example, a stretch receptor, while it can send a signal to the brain and let the brain know, hey, I'm being stretched right now, it can also send a direct signal to motor neurons there in your digestive tract that will activate that smooth muscle, that will activate the appropriate glands to secrete whatever needs to be secreted. So it's kind of got a mind of its own. It doesn't need to be controlled or influenced by the brain. So that's your enteric nervous system. We don't get too much into this at all in this class, but if you were to take a more advanced like digestive anatomy class or maybe even physiology class, you might learn a lot more about that direct communication that's happening here in your digestive tract organs. So for us, we kind of group these together as all part of the autonomic. So your central nervous system does the processing based on all those sensations coming in, whether you're consciously aware or not consciously aware, they're all coming in. The brain and spinal cord then are going to initiate these responses, but those responses of the effector tissues here are going to be directly communicated by these little messenger neurons. So that's what we refer to as our motor division. The motor division includes somatic motor neurons. Somatic motor neurons are the ones that control your voluntary skeletal muscle. So the motor neuron that I drew on the board on Tuesday was a somatic motor neuron. Again, body, soma means body. So all skeletal muscle is controlled by somatic motor neurons. These are your voluntary, conscious motor neurons. Autonomic motor neurons are the neurons that are going to control your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, and your glands. So those are your involuntary tissues. You don't have conscious control over autonomic motor neurons. Whether or not these motor neurons get activated to send an action potential or they don't is solely dependent on decisions being made by your autonomic nervous system that's being processed here. So autonomic sensations come in, and then we get this autonomic motor response. You've probably heard of like your fight or flight responses, your rest and digest. That's your sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of this autonomic nervous system. Autonomic motor is going to be what's controlling smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands of the body. We have a whole lecture dedicated solely to the autonomic nervous system. We'll focus on that. And again, I'll kind of group the enteric part of that into it as well. Peripheral nervous system versus central nervous system. So of course, if something's coming from the body, it's probably outside of the CNS, right? So that's where we get communication into the brain and spinal cord. The sensory division is all going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. Motor outcomes, right? To end up at these effector tissues, the motor signals have to be traveling through your body, so that's also going to be part of your peripheral nervous system. But again, everything is routed through the central nervous system, through the brain and or the spinal cord. We talked already about the neuron, right? We know that our neuron responds to a stimulus. That means it's excitable. Neurons don't fire all by themselves, right? They have a receiving end. They have to receive a signal, right? That's what's gonna be the stimulus. The excitation event is the action potential. We know neurons conduct that electrical signal, that excitation. That action potential travels from the axon hillock all the way down every single axon branch to every single axon terminus. That's what it means to conduct. Neurons do not spread their signals like sideways. So axons that are running together in a nerve are not going to trigger neighboring axons. It doesn't work that way. The conduction is through one axon to its own terminus. At the end of an axon, we know a neuron secretes. That's the exocytosis of neurotransmitter. That is the chemical signal that's going to either activate the next neuron or signal something to an effector tissue. So that's your secretion. And again, all together you can summarize that by saying neurons function by electrochemically responding to a stimulus. Right? It takes a stimulus to initiate the action potential, the electrical response, and that results in the chemical release, the neurotransmitter release. So we know all about neurons. Now you know that neurons are these, big communicators. You know the functional divisions of the nervous system. So we can now describe those functional types of neurons. There are neurons in your body that provide sensory signals. These are called afferent neurons. And they almost always terminate, right? That's their end, the axon terminus. They almost always terminate in the brain or spinal cord, right? That's going to be your sensory neurons sending signals in. We call those afferent neurons. Interneurons are going to be 100% contained in the central nervous system, right? They can travel between the brain and spinal cord, but no part of an interneuron would ever leave the brain or the spinal cord. So in order to be an interneuron, it has to be 100% contained in the central nervous system. These are the neurons that are doing the processing, right? The crosstalk, the communication, putting everything together, the understanding, the comprehension, decision making. There's a lot going on. 90% of the neurons in your body are interneurons, found within your brain or your spinal cord. That's it, and completely contained there. Motor neurons, we call them the efferent neurons because they're targeting effector tissues. Motor neurons are the ones that are going to be terminating on the effector cells. These are the ones that control the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle, the skeletal muscle, and the glands in your body. So here's a little simple circuit through the spinal cord showing a sensory neuron receiving a signal out in the skin, like touch maybe, pressure receptor, right? It's going to send a signal into the spinal cord where it terminates in the spinal cord. Sensory neurons usually terminate in the central nervous system. The little gray guy here, this is an interneuron. It's doing some processing, it's doing some integrating. It receives that sensory signal and decides this motor neuron needs to fire. So it's telling the motor neuron to fire. The red one is a motor neuron, cell body in the central nervous system, but axon terminus is out of the effector tissue. So functionally, we've got a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron. Location-wise, I'm looking at two PNS neurons, peripheral nervous system neurons here, and I have one central nervous system neuron. Right? Because it's the only neuron that's 100% contained within the spinal cord, that interneuron. Okay, we'll stop there. We'll do a quick refresh of, this will be a bunch of review here, but this will be great to review on Tuesday. The parts of a neuron, how they fire, and then we'll go a little bit deeper into different types of neurons. All right. Let's get it ready. So lab today, we are doing arm dissection.